Today we're starting with all things panoramic. In this tutorial I'm going to show you exactly how I create a panoramic image from start to finish. Let's head into it. Panoramic images for me started years and years ago when I first studied photography. My college lecturer brought to class a Fuji GX617. It's an old medium format film camera and it only shoots in 6:17 aspect ratio, and I wanted to replicate it using my own camera. For starters, it expands your field of view. If you've limited with lenses, say for example you've only got a 50mm lens in your kit bag, you can simply stitch an image together. You dramatically increase your resolution. If you're shooting panoramic, you'd easily rack up a 100 to 200 megapixel image, which is fantastic. You can print it out and mount it on that empty space you've been staring at for the last few months. Take a panoramic image is to mount your camera onto your tripod and move it from left to right, right to left in small increments, and then loading those up into Photoshop and stitching all those images together. Now to start off, you'll need obviously your camera. I would highly recommend shooting with telephoto lenses because it eliminates distortion and introduces a lot more compression in your images. Anything from about 50mm up is an ideal lens to use for panoramic stitching and a very sturdy tripod. I would also recommend looking at an L bracket for your camera. That way you can mount it vertically onto your tripod, and also a ball head is definitely recommended. And make sure that both your head of your tripod and your base is level, using the spirit guides on both the base and the head. The reason why I mentioned an L bracket earlier was due to the fact that when you mount the camera vertically, the camera's pivot point is directly in the center of the tripod's axis. This means that the camera won't be leaning to one side, it's directly in the center and it's level once you've leveled out your tripod. So that is the cheap and easy way to do panoramas. You can also dive into the more professional side of things, but also more costly. And this is by purchasing things like nodal heads, which will dramatically increase the budget for your shoots, but they do allow you to tweak the camera perfectly and position everything perfectly so that you don't have any parallax or any issues with stitching. So now that you've mounted your camera to your tripod using your L bracket and everything is leveled out, next you'll want to actually switch your camera to full manual mode. This is to ensure that you're in control of the exposure, the aperture and the shutter speed. If you're using anything like aperture or shutter priority, you'll find that the settings tend to change in between shots depending on what the exposure is. And when you stitch all that together, you're going to have parts of the image that are definitely a different exposure, either brighter or darker. You want a consistent exposure throughout the whole image, and the only way to obtain that is by using manual mode. The same goes for your focus as well, because you don't want to shift the focal plane in between shots either. I would also recommend then when you're actually shooting it to overlap each image by at least 25% or so. That way when you load it up into Photoshop, the software automatically recognizes similar parts of two images and then stitches them together. For this particular exercise, I went to the Prince of Wales Bridge near Bristol. I set up my camera, tripod, made sure to expose for the highlights firstly, and then moved my camera back to the starting position and started firing off a few images. For this one on screen was about 10 or 15 shots in total. I always overshoot as well and then crop it back down to a 6:17 format. That way I'm sure that I've got everything I need in there in case I want to maybe move the crop around a bit and find a better composition. It just gives you a bit more play in post-production as well. Now that you've hopefully had a successful shoot in doing a few panoramics, let's head into Photoshop and see how we can stitch those images together. Alright, so I'm in Adobe Bridge. I normally use Adobe Bridge just to sort out all my files and label them and go through them as a quick preview before loading them into Adobe Raw and then finally finishing it off in Photoshop. You can obviously follow along if you're using Lightroom or in Photoshop, whichever you prefer. This is just how I prefer to do things. The process is still the same, the settings are still the same, so you should be able to follow along quite easily if you're using something like Lightroom, for example. Right, so I've already gone ahead and selected the files that I wanted to use for this panorama. I've got 10 photos that I've taken of this specific scene. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select my first image, hold in Shift and select my last image, right click on the images and select Open in Camera Raw. Right, now once that's opened up, all I'm going to do now is Control or Command A. If you're using a Mac, I'm using Windows, so it's Control for me. Control A, Command A, select all the images that you've got and right click and then just go down to merge to panorama. Now, depending on the amount of images that you've taken, this might take a while to process, but once it's done, get a new dialog box with a little preview of your new panorama. Now, you can check whether all your lines are straight, your horizon's straight in this preview. So far, it all looks good. Might need some minor tweaking here and there, but should be fine. On the right-hand side here, you've got a projection option. What this means is essentially it's different ways of projecting the image or projecting the panorama. So if you think of an image being projected onto something else, this is exactly it. The first option would be a spherical projection. Imagine your image is being projected onto the inside of a sphere, so it'll be wide and sort of curved. The next one would be cylindrical, again the inside of a cylinder, more rounded at the top and bottom perhaps. And the last one is perspective, and perspective essentially is just being projected onto a flat plane. Of course, toggle through each of these three to see which one works the best for your image. All images are different, so yours might not be the same as mine. So we can quickly toggle through these and see how it changes the projection mode onto the images. To me, spherical looks about the best. All my lines look straighter as opposed to perspective. Kind of feels like it's leaning over a little bit too much, so I'm going to keep with spherical. So with boundary warp, it's essentially just warping the image a little bit more just so it appears a bit straighter. I tend to always use boundary warp just to make it appear better, and it just sort of feels like it's correcting the image a little bit more. Right after that, I would always keep the apply auto settings unticked, otherwise it's just going to apply random automatic settings. I like to keep things manual. That way I'm in full control and I can choose whatever I want in the image. Lastly, auto crop, you can switch that off and it's going to think about it. But essentially what it means is that if you've got sort of missing edges at the top and bottom or around your image, it will crop the image to get rid of the empty spaces that you may have missed when taking the actual panorama. For this exercise, I'm going to leave it to off because it looks pretty decent. It doesn't look like there are any missing edges. So with all that done, I'm going to click merge and I'm going to give it a name. I've already created one before as a test, so I'm going to just add a 1 to that. And this will take a while depending on, again, the number of images you shot and how fast your system is and all that. So sit back, have a cup of coffee, come back in a few minutes, and then hopefully your image should be done processing. Right, so it's done. Now what Camera Raw essentially did was to merge all the images together and create a DNG file. Now a DNG file is pretty much like a RAW file. It still keeps all the raw data inside of it. It's a 16-bit file in this case, and I can still use Adobe RAW to apply all my changes inside of it. We can now go ahead and mess with our exposure, our temperature, anything that we need to. So first off, I'm going to choose Adobe Landscape as my color profile. This tends to just enrich in the color a little bit more. Next, I'm actually going to crop this image to a 6:17 format, and this is what I said before as to why I always overshoot, because now I can actually move the crop around a bit more. Now I'm going to use this pillar over here as the sort of start of the leading line. Maybe just a little bit more. I'd like those far pillars over there to be sort of on the third as well, but it's not going to be quite as possible with this one. I do also want to crop out that little bit of foreground that we captured in there as well. So move this over just to about there. There we go. Happy with that? I'm going to press enter and apply those changes. Next up, I'm going to ensure again that my shadow clipping warning and my highlight clipping warnings are switched on. That way I can make adjustments and know that my sky won't blow out or my shadows won't be too crushed. So I'm going to make a few adjustments now. So there you can see my highlights are being blown out completely with a red highlight warning. So if I go too dark, you'll get a blue warning, and that means your shadows are completely black. We want to try and avoid that as much as possible. A little bit is fine. Say for example, like that. That's absolutely fine. But I'm going to raise the exposure back. Quite like that. So there's obviously a little bit of fog today at this bridge. I'm going to introduce a little bit more contrast as well. Make sure my highlights are good. And bring the shadows down just a tad, just to introduce a little bit more contrast in the image. Now I don't want to bring in too much white, and that's already going to destroy the image already. So I'm just gonna leave it at 0 for now. I'm actually going to raise my blacks a little bit. So if you look at what it does to, especially this area here, it almost creates like a misty feeling to it as well. It just raises those blacks a little bit more. When I shot this image, I also attached a Pro Mist filter from Tiffin, the 1/8 filter, as well as the Nisi circular polarizer. That just gave me a little bit more contrast, but the Pro Mist filter also just helped to soften the highlights and just create a natural roll-off between the shadows and highlights. So by introducing a bit more light in the black, I get a bit more of a natural roll-off in the shadow areas, which looks quite nice. It just removes that sort of a digital feel to the image altogether. Now I shot this on a Canon R5C, a 45 megapixel camera, so you can see what benefit a pano has. If you really want to print these images as big as you can, a pano is a great way of extending that resolution further and really pushing it to the boundaries of what your computer can handle. In this case, my computer is struggling, so I do apologize if you do hear any fan noise in the background. That is literally my computer trying to just process this image and just stay alive. What I'd like to do next is go down to my calibration slider, and I'd like to just have a look at the colors here. I just want to try and just maybe enrichen the colors of the bridge itself. Not going too crazy. So there you can see a before and after view already between the two, and it just helps to bring that natural color back into play. Before and after. Next we'll go down to color, and it's pretty much white balanced out already. 5300 Kelvin. Should be fine. Can maybe introduce a little bit more vibrance in there. Right, next up I am going to introduce a little bit of clarity in the image as well. All that does is help boost the mid-tone contrast just a little bit more. Alright, I'm going to leave the dehaze slider for now because I'm going to actually use that when making a local adjustment. So right now we're busy with global adjustments. Next up I'm going to be doing local adjustments. If you want a full overview on that, check out my previous tutorial on workflow basics in Adobe Raw. I go through the whole process of global adjustments and local adjustments and how to balance the two out. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, go check it out. Right now I'm just going to quickly hurry through this and get a good usable image. Alright, so pretty happy with that result. I think it looks great. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I quite like the composition. Lovely, just a natural flowing line, this bridge, and going into the total white of the fog on the right hand side. So now that we've covered all the basics, I hope this was useful for you, and I hope this tutorial shows that it is easy to create panoramic images without the need for expensive gear or specific gear that you'd need. You can literally pull this off with a ball head, or in my case I use a 3-way head, and I mounted my camera onto the side just using the cage. I didn't even have an L bracket. I mounted my camera on its side using the actual camera cage from Small Rig, attached the base plate to that, mounted it vertically, and I could go ahead and shoot near perfect level image of this panorama. It's not a lot of adjusting that needs to be done. I might have to go and just make sure all the lines are perfectly straight, but besides that, that's all done in post-production. Yes, you can use a tilt shift lens as well, but in my case it's easy enough to get away with using inexpensive gear to create panoramic images. So if you have any tips and techniques you'd like to share, please feel free, drop it in the comments below. I hope you liked this video. If you did, hit that like button. Please subscribe to my channel as well if you haven't done so already, and make sure the bell notification is activated. That way you get all the updates whenever I post anything new, and you can stay up to date to my latest videos. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. Keep on creating, and I'll see you in the next one.